So my name's Shantel George. I teach at Marist College in New York, and my work is on liberated Africans in Grenada. I'm also very interested in the cola nut and its legacies in Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. So I guess the best way to describe my research is looking at the transatlantic slave trade period and its legacies in different places and the spread of commodities and ideas.
Okay. Just in general, I was just like, I wanted to ask you about, was it your summers and your spending time in Grenada that got you interested in this history, and what did you embrace about Grenada at that time, or what did you feel? What's a better way of wording it? How did you end up loving Grenada, or loving the history, or finding the interest in the history?
Yeah, well, both my parents were born in Grenada. My dad came here when he was 10 and lived with his family in Acton. My mum came to the UK when she was 21, 23 and lived with her auntie in Shepherd's Bush. So, which means that by the time me and my sister were born, we had that Grenadian inflection. So I remember listening to like little tapes my mum used to record when we were singing and talking, and I could hear that Grenadian inflection in my voice in hindsight. So just thinking about the culture that they brought, my mum being like making roti, telling me stuff about Grenada, and my dad kind of less so because he was kind of, raised here for the majority of his life. But that was really formative, shall we say, in my experience. And my mum also used to tell me stories about stuff at the boiling springs, and I was close to my grandparents who lived here. But my first journey to Grenada was when I was 10, and I remember how different it was in terms of people asking you people knowing who you were based on how you walk or how you look like your family. So that kind of intimacy, but also and the food, it was familiar to me, but some things that weren't familiar, such as the toilet, like the outside toilet. This was when I was 10, so 24 years ago. Like those things, for a child, you're not quite used to in the UK. So I remember those experiences and I really appreciated it. In fact, my sister and I said that when we go to Grenada for the first time, we'll kiss the ground because we're so happy, like this is the place where our ancestors, I think I had that recognition that this is where my ancestors toiled, and later on I would know that, the extent of that and the exact conditions that they went through. So it's a very spiritual place, and that kind of came through to me. And also the realization that I wasn't just British. I used to call myself Black British when I was like 15. Then I realized, no, like I've got another identity and culture that I can claim too. So that was nice, knowing that I had another identity. And then I got a Grenadian passport when I was in my early 20s. And that also said something, that I could be a citizen of another place and I could run to somewhere if I wanted to. But just that having that book was important. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So in terms of obviously you're a professor, and what led you to that journey? How did that start off for you? What age did that really start off for you?
I've always liked to research, and history was my strongest subject at school. So I remember thinking about why I chose history over English, which was one of my other strongest subjects. But I think it's that always finding out something new, like whether it's a fact, an event, why someone thought a certain way, so perspective. I always felt that I was accumulating this body of knowledge, so it satisfied my thirst. So I chose history. And then at college, kind of high school, you do like a lot of European history. College, I did like American history, but especially like civil rights, and that really fascinated me. And then it wasn't until I got to university at SOAS that I did African history, Middle Eastern history, South Asian history, and realized that I could honestly study, any place in the world and draw connections, and there'll be a space for me to do so. So then I did my MA in the Caribbean, University of the West Indies, and that was an important space, seeing people that look like you, teaching history.
Which campus were you on?
I went to Mona.
Okay.
Yeah, so I had people like Professor Vereen Shepherd.
That's a big name in itself.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
I was like, okay, so I'll stop there.
Big name in itself.
Yeah, it was. So, and she was great. And so one of my courses with her was on, I think, post-emancipation, Caribbean society. And I was able clearly to make connections between the Africa stuff that I learned at SOAS and the Caribbean stuff that I learned at UE. And so that led me to my project looking at kind of post-slavery African legacies in Grenada.
Your thesis is titled African Indentured Labourers and Their Descendants in Grenada and St. Lucia. And this reminded me personally of something about George Brizet, and he said something about there was people still born in Sierra Leone, who were born in Sierra Leone still in the 1950s. And so my thing is, I just wanted to ask, how did those people actually end up in Grenada themselves? Because there was a lot of Sierra Leoneans in St. Lucia and Grenada for some reason. Okay,
yeah, sure. So initially, let me just say this first. When I conceived of this project on liberated Africans, I wanted to do like a an Eastern Caribbean perspective, because enough had been written about Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad, so I wanted to focus on the small islands, if you like. So I wanted to look at Grenada and St. Lucia, but I ended up just looking at Grenada because it was more viable time-wise, financially. So, so about 50 to 50,000 Africans were sent to the British Caribbean following the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. And they were liberated or recaptured from foreign slave vessels. So, Britain had abolished the slave trade 1807, took effect in 1808, but other nations still carried on. And this was known as illegal slave trade. So around 52,000 of those that were recaptured were sent to the Caribbean. They either were sent via Sierra Leone, which they had like courts that would find out or decide whether ships were illegally slaving, so they would liberate them and send them to various islands, or also St. Helena and also Cuba. So the Africans that were sent to the British Caribbean from Africa, so they were Africans, came via Sierra Leone, St. Helena, but also Cuba. And so many of them didn't spend long. For example, the Sierra Leone, many of them didn't actually spend long in Sierra Leone. Some I found were from the interior of Sierra Leone, but the vast majority of peoples were from the interior of Western Africa, so present day Nigeria, Togo, Benin, and other places. So they were indentured for 1 to 3 years, and they could also be sent or enlisted in the West India Regiment or the Royal Navy, West India Regiment, for a longer period. But so that's how they ended up in Grenada and the rest of the British Caribbean territories.
Okay. You've answered 2 questions, like they said, so the second question I can just ignore. So, the Grenadian history, George Brizet stated that chattel enslavement destroyed the African personality. It terrorized the mind and consumed the body of the African slave. Could you articulate what you think he actually meant by that, based on your own research, or based on your own viewpoint?
Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to meet George Brizet in the 2000s when I did my research, when I first went to Grenada. So his book, I'm forgetting the title now, Grenada, An Island of Conflict, really was important for me. But this was a book, was written a while ago. And so the first thing I would say, what I think he meant was the brutal and traumatizing impact of the slave trade. Dislocation from families, societies, and the daily trauma that people went through. I like that quote. But having said that, one of the things I realized doing the research, and some of the academics that are writing now, recognize that, but they're also saying that the African personality was preserved or reformulated. So what I mean by that is the African personality wasn't eradicated or destroyed. As Brizet said, this survived, and it's interesting to think about that culture, and that's why I was so interested in the nation dance, the Saraka, Obia, Shango, that is the African personality that was reformulated. So I definitely agree with most of the quote, but also thinking about the ways in which we use culture to survive and resist, so our African personality wasn't totally destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of resistance, how do you think they would have used that in terms of resistance?
That's an interesting question. So let's take Obia. There's some fascinating information for many of the Caribbean territories. But let me try and draw on a Pacific case. So in terms of healing, in the Grenadian records, there was someone I believe called, I think his name was Dr. Will, or people calling themselves healers or doctors because this all herbalists clearly in the Caribbean record, instead of like Obia man or Obi woman that Europeans would designate, because they use their knowledge of the natural environment, of supernatural forces to heal and to solve problems and disputes on a daily basis. So I like thinking about that. Even if it's kind of holding on to your culture, to helping you, live your life on a daily basis. That's a way to survive slavery and its legacies.
Mm-hmm. So nation dance, because you've just mentioned it fits in nicely. Nation dance. What exactly is nation dance, and how was it created? Just give me a bit of history rather than me reading it off script. Just give me a bit of history about that.
So it was created. Well, we actually don't know when it was created, but we believe that. When I say we, Lorna McDaniel and other people have done M.G. Smith, Peirce believe that around the 18th century, Africans came together and they formulated this tradition. It's based on several nations. So at present, there are 9. But it's interesting to think about if there were like 20 back in the day, because Africans would have come from various ethnic groups. And so what they did is that they created nations based on these ethnic groups. So take the example of, so the main nations are Coromantee, Igbo, Congo, Rada, and so on. So take the Igbo, for example, and these people would have been from the Bight of Biafra, and they may not always correspond to the present day Igbo groups. They could have been drawn from a wider field, but they came together to be known as the Igbo. Maybe that was the strongest group that could represent that region. So it's fascinating to think about these different groups coming together. So it's about unity, the various African nations getting together, having their own, each nation having their own dance, drumming, music, languages, for example, songs, I should say. But they also, so it's about unity, but it's also about maintaining that distinctiveness. So from memory, I wrote about how some of those some of the groups will say, I'm from the Igbo nation, no one can trample me, I can trample you, for example. So there's a bit of battling there, playfully, but just showing how vibrant our culture is. So it involves singing, dancing, drumming, feasts, and that's where the Saraka comes in, but also venerating the ancestors, respecting the elders, asking them for things that will, help you in the present life. And commonly weddings, funerals, boat launchings, any social event. For example, I know a member of the royal family years ago came to Grenada and Carriacou, and they did a nation dance. So, any kind of ceremony or an event that they want to mark, they would hold it. So I don't think I've actually seen nation dance. I think I've seen it it's on YouTube, for example. There's also some videos elsewhere, but I've spoken to people about it, and it's very much preserving your identity, but also celebrating difference, cultural difference.
Did nation dance exist on the mainland, or was it just in Carriacou or just in Petit Martinique, or was it all over?
So it's interesting that it existed in both. I'm not sure about Petit Martinique. I met this woman when I was giving my talk a week ago that asked me about it. I couldn't answer, but that's something that's fascinating and something that I like to explore. But yeah, existed in Grenada, mainland Grenada and Carriacou. But the difference was in Carriacou, after, I would say, after the abolition of slavery, so 1830s, 40s, because there was no replacement crop, as there was in mainland Grenada, many of the European planters left the island. And so nation dance was free to develop independently and vibrantly without any European control. But in Grenada, the opposite happened. You know, planters, many or some stayed after emancipation, and you know there was definitely a lot of control. But also, you have the importation of African labourers, which meant that their traditions displaced nation dance. So in Carriacou, you know, you have the flight, if you like, of European planters, and in Grenada, you have planters that stayed, but then you also have the imposition, cultural imposition of African labourers and their legacies, which displaced nation dance. So it's there, but my work looked at how it kind of intermingles with African work or Shango, which I can talk about too, because that's quite fascinating. So it didn't eradicate, it didn't disappear. It blended in with African work, which I find fascinating.
In terms of this is not to say there wasn't any African retention in Grenada, but there's a lot that's said about Carriacou in terms of retention. Like, why do you think that from researchers that they believe, or it's been shown that there was more African retention there than there was in comparison to Grenada?
I think it's really the nation dance, and so there have been several studies on the nation dance by various historians and anthropologists, and that's you know, when people think about Grenada and Africa, they think about nation dance, and it's a very unique thing in the Caribbean, because as far as I know, that there isn't nation dance currently in any other islands. Historically, that wasn't the case. I remember reading this article, I can't remember who it's by, but it's on Jamaica, 17th or 17th century Jamaica. It was a musicologist that went to Jamaica and was observing the traditions and spoke to enslaved peoples, and he noticed that they had like a dance and a particular tradition, drumming, singing, for different nations. That was a kind of nation dance, but for some reason that hasn't, from my knowledge, isn't preserved today. So the fact that this tradition has been preserved and it's still in Carriacou is something that has drawn lots of people's attention. You know, the fact that you have distinct nations, you know, Igbo, Congo, Coromantee, etc. And people are able to tell you something about that nation in terms of drumming, dance, or even language or certain place names in the continent is quite unique.
Okay, so 33% of captives were sent through the Bight of Biafra. Biafra would have been Igbo land. So what influence did the people who were taken through the Bight of Biafra have on Grenada? What influence did they actually have?
That's a good question. So many. So one of the things I found, I know we might talk about this, but an individual called Igbo Jim, and he, around 1838, seemed to have written a letter to a Grenadian newspaper addressed to the Igbo people in Grenada. So he was writing from Trinidad, but he lived in Grenada, and he was writing to Trinidad. Lived in Grenada, but he went to Trinidad. He was writing to the people of Grenada, saying, "My Igbo friends, in Trinidad it's really bad. You know, there's sandfly, there's no mango, there's no kind of key food items for you to survive." And so he's writing negatively about Trinidad in order to dissuade African Grenadian people, African people to migrate to Trinidad, because this was a big problem at the time for European planters. So I was writing about this, and I was talking to my supervisor, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I found this is great." But then I began to think, this might not actually be an African writing, because using very derogatory terminology to describe sort of the people in Igbo Jim, and I just felt it was very kind of character-alike. And I think actually it might have been a European pretending to be Igbo Jim. So assuming that identity. But even in assuming that identity, I think it's quite important because it shows that the Igbo were a significant majority or were important enough for a European to be impersonating an Igbo and writing about this case. So in terms of that, also thinking about just people from the Bight of Biafra generally, there's a word and it exists in many Caribbean territories called bakra, white man, and it comes from the Ibibio people who are from the Bight of Biafra, and I think the word is Mbaraka, and so obviously this changed over time. So that's one legacy. It's a big one, isn't it? Like Bakra. There's also Obia, and there are different African origins for this, but the Igbo is one of them. There's a figure called Norman Paul as well, who was an African practitioner, African work practitioner, but he also was a nation dance practitioner and spiritual Baptist. And he talked about his mum or his grandmother being of the Igbo nation and celebrating that nation. So in terms of nation dance, the Igbo, I would say, was one of the 3 top nations in that group. So I think the first one would have been Coromantee, Igbo and Congo, but these are the 3 main. So Igbo being one of them shows how significant they were.
So for example, Igbo and Moko are the only 2 nations originating from the Bight of Biafra interior currently represented in the nation. I know that the word Moko has been translated to mean doctor, but does the Moko Jambi we see today come from the same region?
Interesting, so I don't know about Moko being translated as doctor. Maybe I'll look that up, that's interesting. But definitely, so the Moko, and I found that term, that description, a lot during my research, and it actually is said to represent the Ibibio people. So anytime you see Moko, apparently it's the Ibibio people and people surrounding where that ethnic group live. So I remember my mum's second cousin told me that he was from the Moko nation. So that was quite personal to me, and I was thinking that maybe I have Ibibio origins. And so I believe this kind of is a legacy that can be seen in the Moko Jambi, but I haven't investigated that. But yeah, the Moko being people from that region.
Yoruba influence, was there any Yoruba, what in particular came from the Yoruba people, if there's anything?
Yeah, so particularly their influence seems to be strong in the post-emancipation period where I'm studying. So the main example is Shango, or what is also known as African work. So Yoruba indentured peoples, but also peoples that were Fon, so peoples from the Yoruba Fon region, reformulated or recreated Shango or Orisha worship in Grenada. So that's the main thing that I study. So in terms of the veneration of deities like Shango, Ogun, Yamanja, etc. Some of the colour symbolisms, language, for example, the key language of African work is Creole and Yoruba. So often people are able to sing songs in Yoruba, but they may not know the exact meaning of those songs. I found that fascinating. Words such as OT, which means rum, OB, which is another thing I study, which is the cola nut that's used in divination, Omi, which I think is water. So they have some people that I spoke to in Munich, and some of the Orisha adherents have retained these Yoruba words, which are fascinating. In fact, it's fascinating to go there and hear them, remember these words or songs. Yeah, so that's prominent in present-day Grenada.
So what exactly is Shango, and how did that come about?
So Shango is one of the deities in the Yoruba Fon religion, known as deity for thunder and lightning. And so the tradition in Grenada and even Trinidad and in other places as well is come to be known as Shango. But present day people also call it African work. And so around So 1,000, M.G. Smith says around 1,000 Africans came to Grenada, and many of them are Yoruba. My research shows that they were not all Yoruba, but they came to Grenada and they reformulated this tradition. And so they retreated after indentureship in places like Munich, Concord and Le Mode, and many of them practiced African work. So they were semi-isolated, so were able to really have autonomy and focus on their African traditions. So that's why it's, it persisted to this day. So it's dancing, it's venerating ancestors, it's having feasts, divination, and many other things associated with that spiritual practice.
Okay. What was I going to ask? Oh, right. So things like, it just came to my head.
Okay.
So things like you hear about spiritual Baptists, Shango, Shakers, which I think is an offensive name for the spiritual Baptists. Okay, so these are different things, or are they all the same thing?
They're different things.
Okay, in what ways are they slightly? So what is spiritual baptism, the spiritual Baptist faith then, in comparison to?
So I would say they're different things, but what's so interesting about it is that they fuse at certain times, and depending on the individual. So spiritual Baptist, as you mentioned, they used to be called Shakers in St. Vincent, and really people kind of expressing themselves in an African personality, if you like, but combining that with Christianity. And so trance will be important, or speaking in tongues, but very kind of enthusiastic type of Christianity. I actually went to a spiritual Baptist church in northwest London a couple of years ago, and that was an amazing experience. I've been to spiritual Baptist churches in Grenada. So that's, and they're known by wearing kind of white or red, and the colours mean something. White, for example, means purity, and red, the blood of Christ. But it's interesting that those colours also mean something in African work. So there's that kind of translation or blending of both traditions in that. Also, spiritual Baptists, they feast too. They have feasts, which is similar to African work. So they dress similar, and have similar traditions. And African work being clearly something that involves, I should have mentioned this before, but the sacrifice of animals, that's quite distinctive. And most spiritual Baptists don't do that, at least within the spiritual Baptist faith. They might be involved in that in African work, but not in spiritual Baptists.
But one of the things I did want to mention is, like, for example, African people were enslaved in Grenada, but they weren't exactly, because of that enslavement, obviously you're not allowed freedom of expression for most of the time. But what really happened to people who practice Shango, who were spiritual Baptists, in terms of government? Because I know there was like a lot of kind of oppression. What actually happened? Because I know it's only like 100 years that a lot of people have only been able to express that, and it's been delegalized, decriminalized, for lack of a better word. Yeah, so that's something that I'm very much interested in. I'm still thinking through it. So the people that practiced African work were sent after slavery. So the argument is that they had freedom and autonomy to develop this and to practice this, versus traditions that happened during slavery. There was less freedom. This is one of the things, one of the reasons why African work is relatively strong in Grenada and in other islands. But what I found interesting is that there were spiritual Baptist ordinances in Grenada, as well as ordinances or laws against obeah, which would have also criminalised certain practices that African work practitioners would have done. So I didn't actually find any specific law against African work, but I found laws against drumming, obeah, and spiritual Baptists that would have affected African work practitioners. And in Grenada, laws against obeah and spiritual Baptists are still on the books. As Grenada, Trinidad and St. Vincent, they have been repealed, but not in Grenada. So all these things, I think, lead to the
the lack of legitimization for African work practitioners and some spiritual Baptists in Grenada. So that's something that I'm interested in. And some people mention too how during the 50s and 60s, you know, they were persecuted, and so I want to find out more about that. So that's part of my PhD, which I'm still thinking through. But yeah, it wasn't an easy time, just because they had the autonomy, as I mentioned, in the various villages. Colonial officers still wrote about like their pagan practices, you know, that they were reportedly doing.
Okay, all right. That's always interesting to hear, because it's got enough time. I was also thinking of that when I watched what was it I watched? Noel Clark.
Oh yeah.
And he went to the church in Bight, and I was just thinking like, about maybe they're all free now doing what they want, but maybe about 60, 70 years ago, that wouldn't have been, they wouldn't be able to walk around with that kind of freedom. Maybe 70, more than that, longer than that probably. But 70 years ago, they would have been probably persecuted for that.
Who do you think you are?
So yeah, that was.
And I watched it.
They tend to find themselves in Grenada quite a lot these days.
Oh yeah.
They were there.
Naomi
Harris. Obviously, Noel Clark. I think they were there for another one as well.
Is it? Oh.
Maybe I'm wrong, but those two, I remember they were there. They were there for the. Grenada and Trinidad. I know the answer to this, but it's just put it on camera. Why are these two countries so intertwined and connected?
I know, and that's something that really fascinated me. So, because of migration from Grenada, you know, after slavery, many years after too, indeed, to Trinidad, so the hundreds or thousands, you know, of workers that went to that island after slavery, you know, building communities, but also from other islands like St. Vincent, St. Lucia, you know. So for my work, I look at, you know, the Grenadians, especially those that were born in Africa, but these liberated Africans that were sent to Grenada, the ones that moved from Trinidad and then came back. People like Norman Paul, who his dad was born in Munich, so I'm assuming that he's a descendant of a liberated African. But he was an important African work practitioner. He went, you know, back and forth different places, and you find that practitioners do that even today. Spiritual Baptist practitioners go back and forth, and there's lots of dialogue with the island, between both islands. So yeah, it's just that movement. People even going seasonally for work, and then coming back to Grenada.
There was a French Creole that was spoken in Grenada. Is this partly to do with the enslaved Africans that were brought over from the Senegal, Gambian region, and or is it to do with Africans that were brought over from Martinique? How did that Creole end up there, if you know?
Yeah, so I remember there was this woman called Miss Lydia. I think I spoke to her in 2015, and she was probably, in terms of the area, so like, you know, St. Patrick's and Andrews, she was like the woman who like spoke a great deal of French Creole. She passed away, but there's some people that still remember those words, and my grandmother will remember those words, but we know that because it was like a language of secrecy, it wasn't really passed on. Just to say that. But so the Africans that were sent to Grenada during enslavement, and even in, you know, the liberated African period, they wouldn't have been conversant in French yet, because when we're thinking about colonization, that happened, say from the 19th century. So during enslavement period, they would have spoke their various African languages, and those various African languages from, you know, various places would have been combined with the language of the French slave masters, and even the language of, you know, when they left, the Catholics and their leaders would have combined to create this French Creole. So definitely an amalgamation of African languages and the language of the religion and the state.
How did the Temme become so influential? The reason why I asked that is because I've seen there's like a big, not big, it's quite a thin book, but they've decided to make this book particularly about them. Was it just that they just drove more numbers, or does that go back to the Sierra Leonean thing that you were talking about? Because aren't the Temme from Sierra Leone?
They are. So I wasn't able to identify whether the liberated Africans from Sierra Leone had any influence in the Temme nation dance, but they could have. So I actually don't know why the Temme is so distinctive, but it was one of the nations that when you go to Grenada, called Carriacou, you ask people, they seem to remember Temme amongst other nations. I know Angus Martin and another person wrote that book, but I think it's also because of the openness or the willingness of, or the connections that Angus Martin made with peoples in Sierra Leone, where he worked there for a while. So he had links, and so they came together and did a book and engaged. Some Sierra Leoneans went over to Grenada, and so this is, I think, where the kind of relationship that formed the book, that context in which it began. But equally, I guess one can do a book on the Coromantee or the Igbo. Yeah, that's my belief.
That's true. Alright, so we have another interview. Unfortunately, I can't find the website anymore. Grenada 40.
Oh no!
Yeah, he mentioned something about those that practice African work or Shango or spiritual Baptist traditions in the island have not been given their due respect. In what ways do you believe they haven't been given their due respect, and why should they be given their due respect?
Yeah, I like that question. So, I had a story to answer that too, because when I was in Grenada doing my fieldwork, my auntie and I think both my grandparents were like, Chantel, why are you going there? Like, why? These people, they do this, they that, you don't know because you haven't been in this country. And I was like, oh gosh, well, yeah, you're right. But you know what, I want to take the risk. This is my research and I'm so intrigued. But so there's lots of, these people and their traditions are stigmatized. So the Pentecostal church, I think, has a role in it too. They would say that this person brung demons. So people will be presented in the church and say, oh, this person's been possessed by so-and-so who's a Shango practitioner, and the spiritual Baptist will drive out that demon. And actually one of, I mentioned his name, Donovan Peters, one of the spiritual Baptists in St. Andrews, said to me, who's worse? Like the person that throws the stone? I can't remember. So just the fact that both, he said, it's a really good analogy, but just the fact that both Pentecostal minister and African white practitioner are both involved in sending or taking away demons just shows how they're both involved in some sort of spiritual work. But yeah, it's to do with the criminalization, which I mentioned earlier, and just like how African cultural practices were demonized during slavery, after slavery.
And do you think it's probably a lot to do with like why you think they should be given them respect? It probably helped people through a lot of things.
Definitely. So yeah, people need to remember that, and many people do, that legacy, whether it's knowledge of herbs, whether it's prayer, whether it's feasts. So Saraka is something that's very much sort of mainstream and recognised, but other things are not, like African work. And there's the opposite in Trinidad, where there's a national holiday, at least for the spiritual Baptists, and there's recognition of some of those practices. So it definitely does need to, and I hope that my book, when I finish it, I hope my book will contribute towards that. That's just a big hope. But I actually spoke to the Grenada Minister of Culture, Brenda Hood, but this was years ago. I don't think she's currently the minister, but she said that they're working to, get recognition for these communities, but it is a long journey.
Just a little bit, could you, it's kind of like the 5 W's type of question. Saraka, why, how, where, how did this come into being, and what exactly is it for people that are watching?
So it's a feast where people celebrate they celebrate their ancestors, they pay homage to their ancestors. They will, they would serve a portion of food to their ancestors that's supposed to be prepared without salt, because ancestors and spirits don't like salt. That's an interesting thing about that. But And then after that, you would distribute food around the community, and you would children, especially children, adults too though, can eat on like banana leaves, and laid out on the ground, and that's a beautiful scene too, and eat. So it's really a community celebration. And what I found out that it comes from enslaved as well as liberated African Muslims. So Sadak, which is a practice by African Muslims and other Muslims, is about this feast, is about honouring our ancestors, about offering. So that comes from Muslims that were enslaved in Grenada. So often we think about people having African traditions or traditional African religions. What about those who were Muslim and enslaved? So it comes from, some of the Western African communities that experienced Islam and brought that to Grenada. So I believe there's only 2 parishes where they practice it now. River Sally in St. Patrick's, which my family is from, and La Poterie in St. Andrews. And I was thinking why it's the case, but when I looked at the fact that there were like several, like the main sugar plantations were in these regions, it makes sense that more enslaved and liberated Africans were sent to these regions. And these regions are a really important beacon of culture. And I wish I could mention individuals that are involved in that practice, but their name escapes me. Miss Lizzie, she could be even 100 now. She's still alive, but I think she was in her late 90s when I spoke to her. Is one of these peoples in River Sally that has, maintained the tradition and is very proud and energetic about it. So it's really up to these individuals, mostly women, who have, maintained this tradition. So that's another thing, thinking about the gendered aspects of it, right? So if these traditions are persecuted, who are more affected? Mainly women.
Okay, now it fits right in nicely to my next question, which is, women have been at the forefront of such traditions, all right? So, and many things, not just traditions, just the whole society thing across the whole Caribbean in general. Like, do you think there's a lack of respect, and in terms of women, and do you think more women should be highlighted? Is there anyone in particular, like you've just mentioned, an individual that you think should be highlighted?
So apart from Miss Lizzie, Miss Ruti, who's involved in African work and spiritual Baptist work. Mother Annie, who died, I think, in 2010. Miss Christine McQueen, who lives near Sates, I forgot the village now. So speaking to these women and finding out their histories, often, all the cultures often passed down through their mothers, and speaking to the women who are cooking, for example, in some of these traditions, you learn a lot about the culture and about their resilience. So I think it definitely does affect them, they're often accused of being obi women or, and the like. But these are the ones that have really passed down some of the cultures.
So is there concern about documentation? Because when I think about documentation, I've been into places in, I think it was Temme, where they have the offices, the Botanical Gardens complex, and they used to hold documents in there. Actually, they still do. And when I went in there, I could see these documents just crumbling by pieces. And I remember watching this program, and this was in Guyana, this was in Grenada, by an academic called David Dabadie, and he went to research his family, and he was looking at the books, and the records were just literally flying out the window. That's how bad it was crumbling. So what do you think should be done about in terms of documentation? Is it a thing where, obviously sometimes we know governments are cash strapped, and sometimes it's, even though they're cash strapped, is it something that maybe the diaspora could help out with? Or what do you think we should do about that?
It's an issue, because I remember too, items disintegrating as I touched it, and arguably I shouldn't have been allowed to touch it if it wasn't in a good order. And also hurricanes, like these natural disasters affect because I wanted to view some parish records, but some of them were destroyed during Ivan and others. But yeah, digitization is really the way forward, and I'm not sure. I don't think I've seen any like large project in terms of digitalization, but I could be mistaken. I know some other islands and Sierra Leone and other African territories like Sierra Leone have done it, and many other territories or countries have won like a British Library endangered archive grant, which and there's other ways, allows them to preserve particular collections, allows them to digitize them, and so they're available for people online. So that's really the way forward, and I hope that that's happening, and I certainly would like to find out more about that.
Okay, and the penultimate question, what parts of do you think there's any parts of Grenadian history that you think still need to be explored? One for me, not necessarily directly Grenadian history, but it's connected, is I'm particularly interested in the Grenadians that went to Aruba and Curacao,
Okay.
but I don't think much was documented. Like if you go to the National Archives in Kew, you've got birth records of people that were born there, but it's not much after that. Like you have little correspondence and whatnot, but after that there's like this big missing hole. Yeah, so are there anything that you think still needs to be explored historically?
Yeah, so many things. Well, I'm thinking anything in particular. I guess for me, I'm interested in like looking at French records, but there's a language barrier for me. But I know for others it might not be the case. I know Angus Martin has written a book on the French rule in Grenada. Yeah, I'm also interested in Grenadians who would have travelled around the Caribbean, and I guess maybe it might be useful to look at the different depositories in those various territories to see what we can hear about them. An interesting and timely project would be on the Windrush. I know, traditionally it's been very Jamaican centric. So, but there have been stories about Grenadians. So just finding out more about their experiences, how it might have differed, when they came, and how visible they are, because I know some of them and some of the smaller islands would have come via Trinidad. And so I wonder if their Grenadian record, at least in the document, in at least how it's documented, might be sort of erased if the port of call is Trinidad, but they came from other islands. And the Grenadian Revolution, a lot more could be said about that in terms of, one of the things I'm looking at is religion, but the role of women, that intrigues me too.
Do you have, you already mentioned it, but I still want to ask you, do you have any future publications or work coming out soon?
Yes, so I'm working on turning my PhD thesis into a book, and it's going to be called The Yoruba on a Rock, African Work, Liberated Africans and African Work in Grenada. So I'm hoping that'll be out within a year or two. Then my second book project is called The Cola Nut in the Atlantic World. It looks at, this commodity from Africa and its legacies around the Atlantic world. So I look at religion, I look at knowledge, power, those kind of themes. So those are the two things I'm working on now.
Okay. The last question I wanted to ask you is that I ask this to everybody. In terms of your work, what would you like your legacy to be?
That's a deep question.
I know.
Oh my gosh. I don't really.
You don't have to ask it if you don't want it. If it's that deep, then
no, I want to answer it. I guess I thought immediately, at least the first book, to kind of make it easier for African work practitioners, spiritual Baptists to do their thing and to kind of gain some recognition, like internationally and also nationally. So that would be amazing. In terms of the life work, I haven't really thought about that, but definitely I like the themes of knowledge, power, agency, and I hope that will resonate with communities, peoples, institutions out there.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. George.
Thank you.